Okay, so hopefully you're watching this on YouTube today, and we're looking at Dr. Lanyon's narrative, which is chapter 9 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So obviously, the biggest thing here, the change from the previous 8 chapters, is that this chapter we have a new narrator. And remember, we have become Mr. Utterson reading this account. So we are reading exactly what Utterson is reading. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. Just a reminder there, they're old school friends. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that would justify the formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. Just notice how we've got it's in first person, haven't we? Got the eyes, and we're actually, the rest of the novel has been written in third person, even though we've followed Utterson. It's been written in something called privileged third person, where we follow the kind of thoughts and the viewpoints of Utterson. But now we're in a completely different world. It's Lanyon speaking, and he's speaking in first person. And he's telling us how he's received a letter from Dr. Jekyll. So now the narration is going to switch again temporarily to Jekyll writing this letter. So let's read the letter. 10th December 18 whatever. I read about this. They don't put the years in. And apparently one of the reasons they do it is to make it seem a bit more like it's almost like it's a piece of evidence. Apparently it was something they did in in scientific reports, and to make it seem like this is real. So in a way, what Stevenson's doing when he doesn't put the exact year, it's like redacted information, and he's trying to make it seem like it's something that really actually happened. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends. And although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, so remember that's the thing that kind of they argue about. Remember in the 19th century, lots of kind of new theories in science were developed, and it was a time of scientific debate, and certainly Lanyon and Jekyll seem to have fallen out about this. I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when, if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honour, my reason depend on you, I would not have sacrificed my fortune or my left hand to help you. So Jekyll's basically saying, look, even though we disagree about science, we're still great friends, and I would give my left hand to help you. That's how kind of good a friend Jekyll is to him. Lanyon, my life, my honour, my reason. A good little list of 3 here. My life, my honour, my reason. Reason is kind of my logic, are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. So he's desperate. He needs help from Lanyon. You might suppose after this preface that I'm going to ask you for something dishonourable to grant. Judge for yourself. So he's saying, look, you might be worried that I'm going to get you into something dishonourable, which as Victorian gentlemen, they really don't want to get into. But he's going to let him judge for himself. And I guess we as readers can judge as well. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. So he's telling him to take a cab, drive to his house. He's like giving him instructions of what he wants him to do. Paul, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced. So they're going to break open the door to his cabinet. This is the very same one that Utterson broke down in the last chapter. And you are to go in alone, to open the glazed press, letter E on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand. Notice how that's in italics. He desperately wants everything that's inside this drawer that's marked with the letter E. The 4th drawer from the top, or which is the same thing, the 3rd from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, so we get a little insight here into Jekyll's mindset. He's extremely distressed. I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents. And here are the things that he's looking for. Some powders, a file, and a paper book. Now, remember, a file, we often call it a vial as well. It's like a little bottle of usually of liquid. So he wants 3 things there. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. Remember, this is where Lanyon lives. He lives in Cavendish Square. And so he wants him to bring back everything in the drawer. And just the main thing about Jekyll here is he sounds desperate. And it's a very strange thing to ask your friend, because he's not really telling exactly why he needs the contents. That's the big question. We don't know why. It's an enigma, a mystery that we need to solve as a reader. Okay, move on to the next page. This is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on a receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen. So he's worried about, he wants to give him plenty of time to do it. He's going to give him till midnight to go get the drawer, because he's worried about something getting in the way. But because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight then, so at midnight, I mean, it's classic, isn't it? It's at night time. You think of the connotations of things that happen at midnight. It sounds a little bit dodgy, doesn't it? Then I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name. Now that's really strange. So someone's going to turn up saying they're Jekyll, but they're not going to be Jekyll. They're going to be someone else. So, who is this? And of course, we might be thinking, as the readers of this book, well, that's probably going to be Hyde, isn't it? And to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you would have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. So he'll be really thankful for doing this. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. So if you fail to do this, it could lead in Jekyll's death or the shipwreck, lovely metaphor there, of his reason. He's going to go mad if you don't do this. And he says as well, he will give an explanation if you want after you get there, but it might be a bit odd. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, so this is when he's writing this, in a strange place, labouring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that, if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. So he's saying, look, if you do what I say, he uses this lovely simile here, then all my troubles will roll away, fade away. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend H.J. So there's some imperatives here. Serve and save, both imperatives. Commands. And we've always heard about kind of the animosity between Lanyon and Jekyll, but we really get here by the use of dear and by the use of your friend that actually, he sees them quite closely. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. So we get that idea of disappearance again, that he's worried about him disappearing forever. Just notice really all this PS is about is kind of extra. It just presents, he's even worried about the post, he is distressed. And now we go back here. Now we go back to Lanyon, okay? This is now Lanyon speaking again. Upon the reading of this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane. So he thinks that he reads this, well, there can be one thing for it. Jekyll's gone mad. That's what he thinks. This letter is insane. But till that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. So he is going to do as Jekyll has asked, even though he thinks it's insane. The less I understood of this far ago, this like nonsense, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal to an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from my table, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival, so everything happens as planned. He had received, by the same post as mine, a registered letter of instructions. So Paul, too, gets a letter. Letters are so important in this novel. They pop up all the time. And had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesman came while we were yet speaking, and we moved it in a body to old Dr. Denman's. So this is Dr. Hunter, okay, but he gives him a different name, okay. Dr. Denman, remember that's the old surgeon that owned Jekyll's house. Surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. So remember, his cabinet is linked to the theatre. The door was very strong, the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. Now this bit is really a little callback, isn't it, to a callback to Utterson breaking the door. Again, basically saying that this is some door that is really hard to break down. And even the locksmith was like, whoa, this should be some, you'd have to be really strong to break this down. It's kind of a compliment to the heroic nature of Utterson and Poole that they managed to get it down in the last chapter. Remember, this chapter, by the way, if I've not mentioned this word already, really feel like I should. I'm just going to go back to the first page. This is all like a flashback in some ways. We're going back. Remember, Lanyon is dead. So this narrator is kind of filling in the gaps of things that happened. I've already shown you in this lesson what happened in chapter 2 and chapter 6. This kind of fills in the gaps between those two things. But this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work, the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. So the first part of the plan goes pretty straightforwardly. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain that they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. So that's interesting. They look like they've been made by Jekyll. So Jekyll has made these himself. So made by Jekyll. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of a white colour. Now this sort of white powder is obviously going to be quite important. Remember, it's also what they found when Utterson and Poole went into the cabinet. They found lots of this salt everywhere. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor. So it's blood red. I think the colour symbolism here is important, okay? We think of that colour. The blood red, it kind of, the connotations are of kind of, it makes me think of kind of gothic stuff like Dracula, the sort of blood and horror. Okay, it makes me kind of think of horror as well. Which was highly pungent to the sense of smell and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. So it smells really strong, and also it's volatile. It feels like it's a bit unstable chemically, for all you chemist fans out there. At the other ingredients, I could make no guess. The book, I've lost some. Just trying to make it. Okay, the book was an ordinary version book and contained little but a series of dates. So there are a series of dates in this. I just realised I put that on the quiz as a not right answer. Okay, well, there was a better answer than series of dates, as we're going to find out in a minute. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago and quite abruptly. So there were loads of entries in this book, but a year ago they stopped. Here and there, a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, double, occurring perhaps 6 times, in a total of several hundred entries. So lots and lots of entries. And once very early in the list and followed by several marks of exclamation, total failure. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. Here was a phial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments. So this book is a record of experiments, and we can kind of, again, as a reader, we're playing a bit of detective here. We know that at some point he was doubling the quantities. At one point there was total failure, and then about a year ago he stopped making them. So that implies we can infer success, that something in his experiments went right about a year ago. That had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. So he's basically criticising Jekyll's experiments. So there was no practical use for all these experiments. Who knows what he was up to? How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honour, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? So these questions, again, if we thought Utterson was rational, well, Lanyon too is incredibly rational. So he's confused, very confused by this. And even granting some impediment, why was the gentleman to be received by me in secret? Why keep it a secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. So he legitimately thinks that that Jekyll was suffering from kind of a brain sickness. And though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defence. So he gets a gun to protect himself. He's worried that Jekyll was tied up in some really dodgy stuff, and so he's got this gun for self-defense. So again, some slight action. We had the axe in the last chapter. Now we've got a gun. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London. Remember, ere just means, you might remember from Shakespeare, means before. Before the knocker sounded very gently on the door, I went myself at the summons and found a small man. The height, we know pretty much straight away this is Hyde. The height denotes, for us as a reader, if we've read this book, we know that he is always kind of, described as being small. Crouching against the pillows of the portico. Are you come from Dr. Jekyll? I asked. He told me yes, by a constrained gesture. So he's kind of constrained, he's struggling with himself. And when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. So, he is looking round. He's very shifty. It's like he's just done something terrible. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bullseye open. Now, a bullseye is like a lantern. So the policeman is on the search for Hyde, and at the sight, I thought my visitor started and made a greater haste. So Hyde gets in, runs into sort of Lanyon's house when he sees the policeman coming. Clearly, he's committed some kind of crimes, but again, we're not quite sure which ones. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon, so he's ready to fire. Just because he doesn't trust this guy. Here at last, I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck besides with the shocking expression of his face. So his face is, and everyone said this, it's got a really weird expression. With his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and last but not least, with the odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighbourhood. So when he's close by, it feels like there's a disturbance in the air. And also, again, he's almost like always, his muscles feel like they're always moving, always kind of jerking and twitching. A little bit like we found him when he was actually dead in the last chapter. This bore resemblance to incipient rigour and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. So when Lanyon sees him, his pulse kind of drops. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic, which just means, individual to you, personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms. But I have since had reason to believe the cause to be much deeper in the nature of man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. So he's had this really shocking reaction to him, but he's thought about it and thought, oh, maybe it's just me. But now he feels that like there's something in Hyde that every man hates. And maybe it is this evil. And maybe it's the kind of evil that is within, I'm not saying we're all evil, but there is kind of anger and hatred in all of us sometimes. And perhaps it's that recognition that when Lanyon sees Hyde, he sees all this hatred. And perhaps it reminds him of the hatred he has for himself. Maybe that's one reason why people feel so strongly about this. Anyway, just a theory. This person, who had thus from the first moment of his entrance struck me in what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity. Lovely quote there, kind of disgusted but curious, like, he shouldn't be interested but he is interested, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabrics, so he's wearing quite nice clothes, were enormously too large. So remember, when we found him dead, he was wearing these clothes too, for him in every measurement. And we have to ask the question, remember, they're Jekyll's clothes that he's wearing. The trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of the coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement just means like it's the clothes you're wearing, was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me. Again, just really hammering home how inhuman he comes across. Something seizing, surprising, and revolting. Again, these lovely list of three there that kind of describes his reaction to Hyde. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit in with and to reinforce it, so that to my interest in the man's nature and character there was added a curiosity. So he's really confused as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. And if you think about it, Lanyon's curious. These were exactly the same things that Utterson was curious about too. So Utterson too was interested in these very same things. These observations, though, have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with sombre excitement. And remember, when that idea of fire links to him. Remember when he killed Carew, there was a great flame of anger. And so it's an interesting motif again that's used. This idea of fire. There's something about when we think of fire, we think of kind of anger. Maybe if you've ever seen Inside Out, the like little guy that plays anger is kind of he's embodied as kind of fire, but also we sometimes talk about fire in creation. If you know about like Prometheus in Greek legend, it was like his fire that helped create kind of humans. So there's an interesting sort of double meaning there, possibly, about this kind of use, this motif. "Have you got it?" he cried. Look how desperate he is. "Have you got it?" Repetition there of how desperate he is. And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. So he's breaking the rules of decorum. Victorian gentlemen not supposed to touch each other. This guy touches him, and it's absolutely in desperation, and he can't hide it, and he's impatient. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. Even his touch, that's been throughout, isn't it? Everyone's had these reactions to him. All kinds of characters have had this similar ice. I think when Utterson and Enfield saw Jekyll at the window, they felt that same ice in their veins. "Come, sir," said I, "you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example and sat down myself in my customary seat, and with as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient, as the lateness of the house, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. So Lanyon's sort of pretending that he's fine, when actually, obviously he's not feeling that fine. I'm just going to try and just tweak that a little bit. Good. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied civilly enough. So he can be civil, Hyde. Rare, but he can be. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the instance of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood—" He paused and put his hand to his throat. Odd little action there. Something's wrong. And I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of the hysteria. Again, hysteria being hysterical, kind of madness. "I understood a drawer." Now, this is actually, it's almost like the It's the opposite. Do you remember of the window? When we saw Jekyll at the window earlier, he too clutched his throat, in kind of horror. But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer, where it lay on the floor behind a table, and still covered with the sheet. He sprang to it and then paused and laid his hand upon his heart. Look at that relief. He's so relieved to get this stuff. I could hear, it's almost like a drug addict, isn't he? He's desperate. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, so with that kind of grating noise. And his face was so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed both for his life and reason. So his face is so ghastly, it's grotesque. "Compose yourself," said I, trying to command him, that imperative again, compose. In his fear, trying to control Hyde. He turned a dreadful smile. We get that kind of oxymoron. Smiles are supposed to be a pleasant thing, denoting happiness. Here it's dreadful. And as if with a decision of despair, plucked away the sheet. At sight of the contents, he uttered one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified. So the way he's acting is absolutely bonkers. And he makes this really loud cry of relief. And the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, "Have you a graduated glass?" he asked. So this is kind of like almost like a beaker, scientific beaker. Now this bit onwards, later in the lesson, I'm going to ask you to look at in a bit more detail. I always think this section could really be a GCSE extract, okay? Anything from it. This is about to be one of the biggest parts of the whole book that we're going to read now. It's one of the reasons why I made us read the whole chapter this time, just because splitting in half didn't really make that much sense to me, because this is the really, really key bit. So just make sure you take good notes for this bit. "I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked." So he gives him the beaker. "He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders." So he adds together the white salt and the red kind of vial. "The mixture, which was at first of a reddish hue just means shade, began, in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in colour." So it starts to brighten, to effervesce audibly, it starts to fizz, and to throw off small fumes of vapour. So we get these kind of verbs that describe this slight change here. "Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased and the compound changed to a dark purple." So we're kind of getting this description here of this experiment of a potion being formed, this mixture, the kind of scientific reactions of the chemicals, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. It changes from red to purple to green, bubbling away. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses, that means changes, with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. So the potion is made. The experiment is kind of complete. And now Hyde is going to talk in a way that we don't hear him speak like this in the whole book, but this is a really key insight. I'm going to put kind of stars around it into Hyde. "And now," said he, "to settle what remains. Will you be wise?" He's going to start asking lots of questions. And he's speaking to Lanyon, but he's also speaking to the reader, because we're about to get the truth of this book. A really big revelation is on the way. "Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and to go forth from your house without further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity too much command of you?" He's criticizing Lanyon and us for our curiosity. You want to know, don't you? You want to watch on, even though you know you shouldn't stay. "Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose," now this is the big kind of question, "a new province of knowledge, This is like, I can enlighten you with new knowledge if you stay and watch, and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you, here in this room upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan. So he's saying he can expose Lanyon to great power, and we get this kind of, at this moment, is true hubris from Hyde, arrogance. He feels like what he's about to show Lanyon will change him forever. You know, Lanyon's a man of science and of religion, and what he's about to see is going to shake his very foundations to the core. And this last bit is really interesting too. Your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy. Prodigy is almost like a child. A child that will stagger the unbelief of Satan. So if you didn't think Satan was real, after you see this child be born, you're going to believe in Satan. And it's very dark, isn't it? We've had so much mention of God in this book and of religion, and here Hyde very closely aligned with Satan. Sir, said I, affecting a coolness that I was far from truly possessing, you speak enigmas. Now enigmas are just, you speak mysteries or riddles. And you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief, but I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see the end. So he is going to watch on, just the same way we as readers, we need to know what's going to happen. And actually, as a readers, we're probably pretty certain what we're about to see, but this is going to confirm it. And remember, for the time this is written, it's an incredibly shocking moment in the history of literature. It is well, replied my visitor. Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. So, you know, as a scientist, he has a duty not to tell anyone, okay? So he must keep it secret, which is one of the reasons why he only lets Utterson know in this letter. And now you, who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, like the views that Lanyon has described as narrow, kind of not enough, very kind of basic views. You who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine. Transcendental, the idea of transcendence is like moving from one world to the next. So it's kind of like, this is really bonkers science here. It's not science. We're really in the realms of science fiction here. You who have derided your superiors, behold, again, the arrogance of that word superiors. Great arrogance, so hubris again. I am superior to you, Lanyon, because I have discovered something you could never find. And there's there's anger at the way that people have kind of belittled his views in the past. Remember, Lanyon and Jekyll had great fallouts over this kind of thing. And now we're finally getting the answers about what they fell out over. The final page. Again, big stuff about to happen here, massive stuff. He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table. So all these verbs used here, dynamic verbs. And held on, staring with injected eyes. Gasping, another verb, with open mouth. Sorry, held as well, and staring. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. We get this punctuation as well as Lanyon struggles to describe what he's going to say. He seemed to swell, another verb. His face became suddenly black and the features seemed to melt and alter. All these key verbs. This is a key moment. This is the transformation, guys. And the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall. He leaps back in fear. My arm raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. So Lanyon is horrified by what he sees. And remember, the child has been born that he's seen here. Oh God, I screamed. And oh God, again and again. Again, it's a classic reaction. When characters are horrified, they cry to God. For there before my eyes, pale and shaken, and half fainting, and groping before him with his hands. Lovely simile here. Like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. So finally, this is the moment, guys, and I'm going to just make sure we all know this. You probably had guessed this, but confirmation. Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And we're going to find out way more in the last chapter, more about this, about how this happened and all that kind of thing. But this moment is the moment we as the readers, it's confirmed. We've suspected probably for chapters and chapters. Well, I know I did when I first read it, but this is the confirmation. What he told me in the next hour, I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. Lovely quote there to get Lanyon's reaction. Obviously, we've got some sibilants there. The alliteration of the S sounds, soul and sickened. And yet now, when that sight has faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. He's absolutely, his life is ruined from witnessing this. Sleep has left me. Remember in Macbeth too, when sleep left Lady Macbeth, she went mad. The deadliest terror sits by me all hours of the day and night. This idea of terror again. I feel that my days are numbered and that I must die, and yet I shall die incredulous. Incredulous means like not believing. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, so this moral kind of chaos, this moral means kind of right and wrong, that man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence, I cannot even in memory dwell on it without a start of horror. So there's great regret from Lanyon here. He kind of regrets his curiosity. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, so Jekyll admits this, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew. Confirmation again that Hyde is Jekyll. I mean, I find that a bit odd that they do that, because I think every reader has pretty much figured it out here, but he does it again just to really hammer home that the stranger was Hyde. I think we'd already guessed that's who it was. Hasty Lanyon. So this is Lanyon's letter from sort of beyond the grave to Utterson. So a massive moment in the book. And like I say, when I think about what they might pick for a GCSE extract, this chapter could well be the one they pick. Okay, so that's it for today's annotation. It was a little bit long, but hopefully now you can return to the Teams lesson with live Mr. Owen, who is waiting patiently for you.